March 15, 1969, Monument Valley, Utah. John Wayne collapsed on the set of The Undefeated at 2:47 p.m. Steve McQueen called cut and cleared the entire crew within 90 seconds. What happened in the next 20 minutes would stay buried for 53 years. The official report said Wayne had exhaustion, dehydration, too much sun. Steve McQueen drove him to the hospital himself, no cameras, no witnesses. They said it was friendship, but 3 people knew the truth. Wayne was dying, had been for months, and what McQueen did to save his legacy, what they all agreed to hide, would haunt Hollywood's golden age forever. The crew signed NDAs. The footage disappeared, and for 5 decades when people talked about that day, they always missed the real story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hook. Frank Morrison's hands shook as he watched the black SUV crawl up his gravel driveway, dust clouds billowing behind it like smoke signals announcing his past had finally arrived. He set down his coffee mug, the one with the faded Paramount Pictures logo that he'd stolen from Craft Services in '68, and reached for the Remington 870 propped against his kitchen doorframe. The documentary crew wasn't supposed to arrive until tomorrow. Frank had spent weeks preparing his story, rehearsing the carefully edited version he'd told himself so many times he almost believed it. But this vehicle didn't belong to any film crew. The windows were too dark, the approach too calculated. Someone had found him. Through his kitchen window, Frank watched 3 figures emerge from the SUV. The woman in the lead wore a tailored blazer that had never seen ranch work, her blonde hair pulled back in a way that meant business. Behind her, 2 men in jeans and polo shirts tried too hard to look casual. One carried a leather satchel, the other kept his hands free. Frank's throat tightened. 53 years of looking over his shoulder, and he'd grown complacent in this Colorado sanctuary. 15 years of training horses and mending fences, telling himself the secret was buried with Duke and Steve. But secrets in Hollywood never stayed buried. They just waited for the right price. The woman knocked with authority, 3 sharp raps that echoed through Frank's modest ranch house. He kept the shotgun low but ready as he opened the door, leaving the chain latched. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Rebecca Chen from Meridian Investigations." She held up a leather credential wallet. "We're here about Monument Valley, about what really happened on March 15, 1969. Frank's blood went cold. "Don't know what you're talking about. We have the missing footage, Mr. Morrison. All 23 minutes of it." The words hit him like a horse's kick to the chest. The footage was supposed to be destroyed. Steve had sworn he'd burned every frame himself, right there in the desert. Frank had watched the film canisters melt in a trash barrel while Wayne lay unconscious in the trailer, 40 feet away. "That's impossible," Frank whispered. Rebecca smiled, and it wasn't friendly. Charles Brennan kept a backup, hidden it for 5 decades in a safety deposit box in Tucson. When he died last month, his grandson found it, along with some very interesting notes. Notes with your name all over them, Mr. Morrison. Notes that describe exactly how you rigged John Wayne's collapse. Frank's grip tightened on the Remington. Charlie Brennan had been Duke's personal assistant, loyal as a hunting dog. Frank had trusted him to keep quiet, but dead men's secrets had a way of resurrecting themselves. "Charlie's grandson is looking to retire early," Rebecca continued. "Seems 50-year-old Hollywood scandals are worth quite a bit to the right buyers. TMZ offered him $2 million, but we convinced him to come to us first. Professional courtesy. What do you want?" The whole story. Not the sanitized version you've been peddling about Wayne having cancer and Steve helping stage his collapse to protect his image. We want to know about the other body, Mr. Morrison. The one that went into the ground as equipment failure, while John Wayne walked away to make 7 more pictures. Frank's mouth went dry as Monument Valley sand. They knew about Tommy Ridgway. Somehow, impossibly, they knew about the young grip who'd been in the wrong place when Duke's medication had made him violent, paranoid, who'd tried to run when Wayne grabbed the prop knife from the table, who'd bled out on the desert floor while Steve McQueen and Frank Morrison made a choice that would define the rest of their lives. "You got 3 seconds to get off my property," Frank said, raising the shotgun. Rebecca didn't flinch. We're not here to destroy you, Mr. Morrison. We're here because someone else is already doing that. Someone who's been systematically eliminating everyone who was on that set. Charlie Brennan didn't die of natural causes. Neither did makeup artist Linda Vasquez last year, or assistant director Robert Chen, my uncle, 3 months ago. Someone's been cleaning house, and you're next on the list. Frank's hands trembled. He'd read about those deaths, dismissed them as Hollywood coincidences. Old people in a dangerous business died all the time. The only thing keeping you alive is that they don't know where you are, Rebecca continued. But they're getting close, and when they find you, that footage becomes our insurance policy. Help us catch them, and we'll make sure the truth stays buried where it belongs. Behind Rebecca, one of her companions reached into his jacket. Frank tensed, but the man only pulled out a manila envelope. These are the pictures from Tommy Ridgway's accident scene, Rebecca said. Take a look and tell me if you still think this is about protecting John Wayne's legacy. The envelope landed on Frank's porch with a soft thud. Through the crack in his door, he could see photographs spilling out. Crime scene photos that should have been destroyed decades ago. Photos that would end everything he'd built if they ever saw daylight. Frank Morrison closed his eyes and prepared to open a door he'd kept locked for 53 years. Frank Morrison stood frozen in his doorway, the weight of the Remington 870 suddenly meaningless in his arthritic hands. The manila envelope lay at his feet like a rattlesnake sunning itself on his weathered porch boards. Through the gap in his chained door, he could see the corner of a black and white photograph. Tommy Ridgway's work boots, the same Red Wings the kid had been so proud of when he'd bought them with his first paycheck. I need a minute, Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca Chen stepped back, her companions flanking her like bookends. Take all the time you need, Mr. Morrison. We're not going anywhere. Frank closed the door and leaned against it, the Remington sliding from his grasp to clatter against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through his small ranch house, 4 rooms and a lifetime of carefully constructed solitude. His hands found the familiar grooves in the door frame where he'd worn the wood smooth with 53 years of worried fingers. Through the kitchen window, he could see his horses in the far pasture. Maggie, his 17-year-old paint mare, lifted her head from the grass as if sensing his distress. She'd been with him for 12 years now, longer than any relationship he'd maintained since Monument Valley. Beside her grazed Cisco, the bay gelding he'd rescued from a kill buyer in Grand Junction. 3 other horses dotted the field, all rescues, all grateful for the sanctuary Frank had built in the shadow of the San Juan Mountains. This was his world now. 200 acres of high country meadow, a barn he'd rebuilt board by board, and animals who asked nothing of him except hay and clean water. No cameras, no directors screaming about the light, no studio executives demanding impossible stunts for impossible deadlines. Just the rhythm of seasons and the honest work of feeding livestock before dawn. Frank walked to his kitchen sink and splashed cold well water on his face. The photograph on the windowsill caught his eye. Himself at 28, grinning beside a blood-bay stallion on the Warner Brothers backlot. He'd been lean and fearless then, convinced that Hollywood magic was worth any risk. The young man in that picture couldn't have imagined standing in this kitchen, 75 years old and still paying for choices made in the desert heat. His coffee had gone cold. Frank dumped it in the sink and watched the dark liquid swirl down the drain, thinking about how many mornings he'd stood in this exact spot, grateful for the simple luxury of solitude. His routine never varied. Coffee at 5:30, horses fed by 6, fence line checked by 7. In winter, he'd break ice on the water troughs. In spring, he'd move irrigation pipe. Summer brought hay season, endless days on the tractor cutting grass for winter feed. Fall meant sorting cattle for the neighbor who leased his pasture. It was a quiet life, deliberately small. Frank Morrison, who'd once doubled for Clint Eastwood and taught Steve McQueen to handle a lariat, now lived like a hermit monk whose only confessions were made to horses. But it was his life, clean and honest and paid for with his own sweat. Through the window, he watched Rebecca Chen walk to his corral fence. She moved like someone uncomfortable with rural spaces, careful where she stepped, eyeing the horses with city-bred wariness. Maggie wandered over to investigate, her gentle nature overcoming caution. Frank saw Rebecca reach out tentatively to touch the mare's nose, and something in his chest tightened. These people knew about Tommy Ridgway. They knew about the cover-up, the lies, the way 3 Hollywood legends had sealed a young man's death behind 50 years of carefully orchestrated silence. But did they understand what that knowledge meant? Did they realize that opening this door wouldn't just destroy Frank Morrison? It would shatter everything he'd built to honor the memory of a kid who died for being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Frank thought about Maggie's trust, the way she nickered when she saw him coming with her grain bucket. He thought about Maria Santos, who brought him groceries every Thursday and stayed for coffee, never prying into his past but always asking after his horses. He thought about Dr. Hendricks in town, who'd removed a tumor from Cisco's leg last spring and refused payment because Frank had once helped his teenage son through a rough patch involving alcohol and a stolen truck. These were the relationships that mattered now. Simple human connections built on nothing more complicated than kindness and reliability. People who knew him as Frank the Horseman, not Frank Morrison, who'd helped bury Hollywood's darkest secret in Monument Valley sand. Outside, Rebecca Chen pulled her hand away as Maggie tried to mouth her sleeve. The investigator wiped her palm on her blazer and walked back toward the porch, where those damning photographs waited like evidence at a crime scene. Frank Morrison looked around his kitchen one more time, at the coffee pot that had brewed 10,000 quiet mornings, at the window that framed his horses and mountains, at the life he'd built from the wreckage of his conscience. Then he walked to the door and unlatched the chain. Frank opened the door and stepped onto his porch, the March wind cutting through his flannel shirt like a blade. Rebecca Chen and her companions watched him with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. The manila envelope lay between them, its contents spilled across weathered pine boards like tarot cards revealing a future Frank had spent decades trying to avoid. He knelt slowly, his knees protesting against the cold, and gathered the photographs. The first image stopped his breath. Tommy Ridgway's body sprawled beside a lighting rig, his red wing boots pointing toward Monument Valley's red spires. But it wasn't the angle Frank remembered. This shot was taken from above, showing details the official investigation had missed or chosen to ignore. The grip tape wrapped around Tommy's wrists, the defensive wounds on his palms, the drag marks in the sand leading away from John Wayne's trailer. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. "Keep looking," Rebecca said quietly. The second photograph showed Wayne himself, taken maybe 20 minutes after Tommy died. The Duke sat in his director's chair, fully conscious, a coffee cup steady in his hands. No trace of the collapse that would become Hollywood legend. No sign of the terminal illness that supposedly explained everything. Frank's hands began to shake as he flipped to the third image. Steve McQueen crouched beside a trash barrel, feeding film canisters into the flames. But in the background, barely visible in the desert shadows, stood another figure. A tall man in a Stetson, watching the evidence burn with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan had worked perfectly. Frank had never seen this photograph before, had never known Charlie Brennan was documenting everything with a telephoto lens from half a mile away. "You recognize him?" Rebecca asked, pointing to the figure in the Stetson. Frank's throat closed. He knew that silhouette, that particular way of standing with one hip cocked and thumbs hooked in a belt buckle. Everyone in Hollywood knew it. "That's impossible," Frank managed. "He wasn't even on the picture." Richard Lansing was never officially on the Monument Valley shoot, Rebecca agreed, but he was there that day. Had been for 3 days, in fact, staying at the motel in Mexican Hat under a false name. Want to guess why the most powerful studio head in Hollywood would sneak into the middle of nowhere to watch John Wayne make a B-grade Western? Frank's mind reeled. Richard Lansing had run Meridian Pictures with an iron fist for 40 years, the kind of man who could make careers disappear with a phone call. He'd died in 1987, taking his secrets to Forest Lawn Cemetery. But if he'd been in Monument Valley that day, Tommy Ridgway wasn't some random grip, Frank realized, the words tasting like poison. He was planted there. "Charlie Brennan's notes are very detailed," Rebecca said. Lansing had been investigating rumors about Wayne's cancer for months. The insurance implications alone could have bankrupted the studio if Duke died mid-picture. So he sent Tommy to get proof. Medical records, pill bottles, anything that could void the coverage. Frank sat heavily on his porch steps, the photographs scattered around him like evidence of his own execution. But Wayne caught him. Wayne's medication made him paranoid, violent. When he found Tommy going through his things, Rebecca gestured at the crime scene photos. It wasn't self-defense, Mr. Morrison. It was murder, and Lansing saw an opportunity. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Lansing hadn't come to Monument Valley to destroy John Wayne. He'd come to own him. A dead grip could be explained away, but a movie star who'd killed someone? That was leverage worth millions. Lansing orchestrated the cover-up, Frank said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. Made it look like Wayne collapsed from cancer. Turned Steve and me into accomplices. And for 20 years, it worked perfectly. Wayne made 7 more pictures for Meridian, never questioning why his contract suddenly favored the studio. McQueen kept quiet because he thought he was protecting a friend. And you, Rebecca studied Frank's face, you carried the guilt for all of them. Frank thought about the last time he'd seen Steve McQueen at Duke's funeral in 1979. They'd stood together at Forest Lawn, neither speaking, both carrying the weight of Monument Valley between them. Steve had looked hollow, eaten alive by secrets that were killing him as surely as the cancer that would claim him 4 years later. Why tell me this now? Frank asked. Lansing's been dead for 40 years. Rebecca exchanged glances with her companions. Because someone's been using Charlie Brennan's evidence to eliminate everyone who was there that day. Someone who knows the real story and doesn't want it coming out. Linda Vasquez, Robert Chen, Charlie himself, all dead in the last 18 months. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to a news article. This ran in the Durango Herald 3 days ago. Local authorities seek information about suspicious vehicle seen near Morrison Ranch. They're already closing in, Frank. Frank stared at his horses in the distance, knowing he was looking at his sanctuary for the last time. The life he'd built from Tommy Ridgway's blood was about to end, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. Frank Morrison stared at the newspaper article on Rebecca's phone, the words blurring as his hands trembled. Suspicious vehicle. He'd been so careful for 15 years, never using his real name at the feed store, paying cash for everything, keeping his head down like a man trying to disappear. But apparently, he hadn't disappeared far enough. I need to think, he said, standing abruptly. The photographs scattered in the wind, but Rebecca's companion, a lean man with cop's eyes, quickly gathered them up. There's no time to think, Rebecca said. They found Charlie Brennan face down in his pool, with A-22 behind his ear. Made it look like suicide until the coroner noticed he was left-handed and the gun was in his right hand. Frank walked to his corral fence, gripping the rough pine rails until splinters bit his palms. Maggie wandered over again, her soft muzzle searching his pockets for the peppermints he usually carried. He had nothing to give her. Another small betrayal in a life built on them. You don't understand, he said without turning around. That vehicle they mentioned? I've been seeing it for weeks. White SUV with Nevada plates, always just far enough away that I couldn't make out the driver. I told myself it was paranoia, old man's imagination. Behind him, he heard Rebecca's sharp intake of breath. Where did you see it last? Yesterday morning, parked by the cattle guard at the end of my access road. Frank's voice sounded foreign to his own ears. Whoever's in it knows exactly where I live. The admission hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Frank had spent 53 years telling himself he was safe, that the desert had swallowed Tommy Ridgway's death along with all the lies that followed. But safety was an illusion, wasn't it? A story men told themselves when they couldn't face the truth. We need to get you out of here, Rebecca said. Tonight. No. The word came out harder than Frank intended. I'm not running anymore. I've been running since 1969, and I'm tired. He turned back to face them, seeing something shift in Rebecca's expression. Fear, maybe, or respect. Hard to tell which. Frank, listen to me carefully, she said. My Uncle Robert thought the same thing. Decided to stop running, started talking to a journalist about Monument Valley. They found him in his garage with the engine running and a suicide note typed on a computer he didn't own. Frank's neighbor, Bill Hendricks, had mentioned seeing a white SUV on the county road last week, said he'd waved at the driver but gotten no response. Just someone lost, probably, looking for the fishing access or the old mining claims up toward Silverton. Frank had nodded and thought nothing of it. But Bill had also mentioned that his border collie had been acting strange lately, pacing the fence line that separated their properties, whining at shadows. Dogs knew things, felt things that humans missed. Frank's own dog, Rex, had died 2 winters ago, taking with him the early warning system that might have saved Frank's life. "Who else knows I'm here?" Frank asked. Rebecca's companion spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a faint Boston accent. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Charlie's safety deposit box was opened 4 days before he died. Bank records show a court order, but the judge who supposedly signed it was playing golf in Phoenix that week. Professional job," Frank said. It wasn't a question. Very professional. Whoever cleaned up Monument Valley in 1969 is still cleaning up today. And they have resources, legal connections, access to official records, enough money to make people disappear without raising questions. Frank thought about Richard Lansing, dead for 40 years but apparently still casting shadows. Studio heads like Lansing didn't just accumulate money, they accumulated debts and favors and secrets that outlived them. Sons and nephews and protégés who inherited more than bank accounts. Lansing had a kid, Frank said suddenly. Mitchell, real piece of work, even by Hollywood standards. He'd be what, 65 now, 70? Rebecca and her companion exchanged glances. "Mitchell Lansing died in a plane crash in 1994, she said. But he had business partners, people who might want to protect their inherited interests. A meadowlark called from the pasture, its liquid notes carrying across the valley like a benediction. Frank had always loved that sound, pure and wild and honest in a way that human voices never were. He wondered if he'd live to hear it again. They're not coming for me because of what I know, he realized. They're coming because of what I might say. Same reason they went after the others. Which is why we need the whole truth," Rebecca said. "Everything that happened in Monument Valley. Every detail, every name, every lie you've been carrying. It's the only way to stop this." Frank Morrison looked at his horses one more time, then walked back toward his house. "You better come inside," he said. "This is going to take a while." Frank led them through his living room, past the stone fireplace where 53 winters of solitary evenings had worn the hearth smooth. The manila envelope felt like a loaded gun in Rebecca's hands as they settled around his kitchen table. The same scarred pine where Frank had eaten 10,000 silent dinners, always setting one plate, always leaving the other chairs empty. "Coffee's still hot," he said, though his hands shook as he poured. The simple domestic gesture felt surreal against the weight of what was coming. "You want to know about Monument Valley? Then you need to understand what came before it." Rebecca pulled out a digital recorder, set it between the sugar bowl and a ceramic mug shaped like a horse's head. "Start wherever you need to." Frank stared into his coffee, seeing Tommy Ridgway's face reflected in the dark surface. 22 years old, sandy hair, gap between his front teeth that made him look younger than he was. Tommy wasn't just some grip looking for dirt on John Wayne. He was Lansing's nephew, sister's kid from Phoenix, needed work after he got out of the army. The admission tasted like poison. Frank had carried that knowledge alone for 5 decades, never speaking it aloud, never even writing it down. But secrets had weight, and this one had been crushing him since the day it happened. Lansing told Tommy it was a simple job. Get close to Wayne, document the cancer, bring back proof for the insurance investigators. Just a few photographs, maybe some pill bottles. Nothing dangerous. Frank's voice cracked. Lansing didn't tell his own nephew that John Wayne was dying of more than cancer. Rebecca leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "The medication Wayne was taking, experimental stuff from Mexico, made him paranoid, violent, hallucinations. We all knew something was wrong, but nobody talked about it. You didn't question the Duke, not ever." Frank stood abruptly, walked to the window overlooking his pasture. Maggie had wandered closer to the house as if sensing his distress. Animals knew things. They felt the tremor in a man's voice, the way fear changed the very air around him. Tommy was searching Wayne's trailer when Duke came back early from a meeting with the director. Found this kid going through his pills, photographing his medical files. In Wayne's mind, Tommy wasn't just some grip. He was a communist spy, a government agent, something out of the paranoid fantasies the drugs were feeding him. The kitchen had grown silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant lowing of cattle in the neighbor's field. Frank could feel Rebecca's recorder capturing every word, turning his confession into evidence that would outlive them all. Wayne grabbed a lighting wrench, hit Tommy once across the skull, then kept hitting him. By the time I got there, the kid was already gone, and Wayne was standing over him with blood on his hands, confused as hell about what had just happened. Frank pressed his forehead against the cold window glass. In the reflection, he could see Rebecca's face, pale with the horror of understanding. That's when Steve showed up, took one look at the situation, and started giving orders. We had maybe 10 minutes before someone came looking for Tommy. Steve sent me to find Lansing while he got Wayne cleaned up and sedated. Lansing was there the whole time, Rebecca said quietly, watching from the cliffs with binoculars. Saw everything. When I found him, he was already planning the cover-up. Not to protect Wayne, to own him. Lansing had his nephew's body, Wayne's blood on the murder weapon, and 2 witnesses who'd helped move the evidence. Frank turned back to the table, his legs suddenly unsteady. We staged Wayne's collapse. 20 minutes later, Steve burned the film from Tommy's camera while I helped Lansing drag the body to where we'd discover it later. Made it look like an accident. Lighting rig fell on him during Wayne's medical emergency. The recorder kept spinning, capturing the destruction of everything Frank had built his life around. He thought about Maria Santos bringing him groceries, about Dr. Hendricks who trusted him with injured animals, about every kind soul who'd welcomed Frank Morrison without knowing they were befriending a man who'd helped cover up murder. The local sheriff bought it completely, Frank continued. Tragic accident during a medical crisis. Insurance paid out, family got closure, and Hollywood avoided a scandal that would have destroyed multiple careers. But Lansing kept the real evidence, Rebecca said. Every photograph, every piece of physical proof. For 20 years, Wayne made pictures exclusively for Meridian Studios at below-market rates. Steve McQueen stayed quiet because he thought he was protecting a friend. And Frank's voice failed him entirely. He sat heavily, feeling the weight of 75 years pressing down on his shoulders. Through the window, he could see the white SUV parked at his cattle guard, no longer bothering to hide. I've been paying for it every day since, he whispered, and now Tommy's finally coming home. Rebecca's recorder clicked off. In the sudden silence, Frank could hear his own heartbeat, the distant whistle of wind through the eaves, and something else, the soft crunch of boots on gravel outside. That's a beautiful story, Frank, a voice said from the kitchen doorway. But you've got the ending all wrong. Frank's blood turned to ice. The man standing in his doorway was tall and lean, wearing a Stetson that cast shadows across weathered features. He looked like he'd stepped out of one of the old photographs, unchanged by the decades that had carved deep lines in Frank's face. Mitchell Lansing, Frank breathed. But you're supposed to be dead. The man smiled, revealing teeth too white and perfect for someone pushing 70. Plane crash in '94. Very convincing. Amazing what you can accomplish with enough money and motivation. He gestured with a chrome-plated 38. Rebecca, darling, step away from our friend Frank. You've done excellent work. Frank watched in horror as Rebecca stood smoothly, her expression shifting from concern to cold professionalism. He bought the whole thing. Uncle Richard would be proud. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He gripped the table edge, his mind reeling as everything he thought he knew crumbled around him. You're working together. Rebecca Lansing Chen, she said with a mock curtsy. Mitchell's daughter. Turns out the family business required some cleanup after all these years. Frank's head spun as the pieces rearranged themselves. The convenient arrival of the documentary crew, the perfectly timed revelation of Charlie Brennan's photographs, the way Rebecca had known exactly which buttons to push, which memories to excavate. The others, Linda, Robert, Charlie, all very real deaths, Mitchell confirmed. But not because they knew too much about Monument Valley. Because they knew too much about what really happened to Tommy Ridgway. Rebecca pulled a thick file from her bag, spread photographs across Frank's kitchen table. Different pictures this time. Crime scene shots that made Frank's stomach lurch. Tommy's body, but not where they'd left it. These showed him in a shallow grave, partially decomposed, with a bullet hole behind his left ear. This is where Charlie Brennan found my cousin in 1987, Rebecca said. Right where you buried him, Frank. Right where you put him after you murdered him. No. Frank's voice cracked. Wayne killed him. I saw. You saw what you were supposed to see, Mitchell interrupted. My father was very good at staging scenes. Tommy was unconscious when Wayne hit him. Not dead. Skull fracture, sure, but survivable. Dad let you and McQueen think you were covering up a murder while he finished the job himself. Frank's knees buckled. He collapsed into his chair, staring at the photographs that rewrote everything he'd believed for 53 years. In his memory, he could see Tommy's still form, the blood on Wayne's hands, the panic in Steve's eyes. All of it real, but none of it the truth. Why? He whispered. Because Tommy got greedy, Rebecca said. Found something in Wayne's trailer that was worth more than a simple insurance scam. Letters from Senator Joseph McCarthy promising to clear Wayne's name from the House Un-American Activities Committee's files in exchange for information about communist sympathizers in Hollywood. Mitchell picked up one of the crime scene photos, studied it like a fond memory. My cousin thought he could blackmail 2 powerful men instead of just one. Called our father from a payphone in Mexican Hat. Demanded $100,000 and a producing credit on Wayne's next picture. Frank felt the room spinning around him. So Lansing killed his own nephew. Business is business, Mitchell said with a shrug. Dad staged Wayne's breakdown. Let you and McQueen burn the insurance evidence while he took Tommy for a little ride into the desert. 1 bullet, shallow grave, problem solved. But you let us think. For 50 years, you let us believe we were accomplices to murder. You were accomplices, Rebecca said. Just not to the murder you thought. You helped cover up Wayne's assault, destroyed evidence, lied to federal investigators. The fact that Tommy died later doesn't change your culpability. Frank thought about Steve McQueen's hollow eyes at Wayne's funeral, about the guilt that had eaten both of them alive. Steve had died believing he'd helped cover up Tommy's murder, when the real killer had been orchestrating their confession all along. We've been hunting you down one by one, Mitchell continued conversationally, because Charlie Brennan's investigation was getting too close to the truth. Can't have people digging up Tommy's real grave, asking uncomfortable questions about bullet trajectories and time of death. The white SUV outside suddenly made perfect sense. They'd been watching him for weeks, waiting for the right moment to extract his confession before tying up the final loose end. Frank Morrison looked at his horses through the window one last time. What happens now? Mitchell Lansing smiled, and Frank saw his father's cold calculation in his eyes. Now you're going to have a tragic accident, just like all the others. Frank's mind raced as Mitchell Lansing's words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The .38 gleamed in the kitchen light, steady in the killer's hand. But Frank had spent too many years on movie sets not to notice the subtle tells. Mitchell was left-handed. The gun sat awkwardly in his right palm, and his stance favored his weak side. Rebecca stood too close to her father, blocking his clean line of fire. 53 years of guilt had just been stripped away, replaced by something far more dangerous: clarity. You made one mistake, Frank said quietly, his voice steadier than he felt. Tommy wasn't just Richard's nephew. He was also Maria Santos's cousin. Rebecca's confident mask flickered. Who? Woman who brings my groceries twice a week. Retired sheriff's deputy. Been wondering for 30 years why her cousin's body showed up with a bullet hole when the death certificate said blunt force trauma. Frank shifted slightly in his chair, feeling the weight of Rex's old leather collar in his pocket, the one thing he'd kept from his faithful companion. Maria's been carrying her own investigation all this time, waiting for the right moment. Mitchell's smile faltered. You're bluffing. Am I? Check your surveillance photos. Every Tuesday and Friday, same time, same woman. Maria Ridgway Santos, Tommy's baby cousin, all grown up and wearing a badge for 25 years. Frank stood slowly, his arthritic knees protesting but his resolve crystallizing. She knows about the white SUV. Been tracking it since you arrived. Through the window, Frank could see movement in the tree line beyond his pasture. Not wind. Too deliberate, too careful. Maria had always been a smart girl, even at 15 when she'd cried at Tommy's funeral and whispered to Frank that something didn't feel right about the whole thing. The documentary was a nice touch, Frank continued, taking a half step toward the sink. But you should have done more homework. Rebecca here made a mistake when she mentioned Charlie's left-handedness. That detail never made it into any official report. Rebecca's hand moved toward her purse, but Frank was already in motion. The hot coffee mug flew from the counter, striking Mitchell's gun hand as Frank dove behind the kitchen island. The .38 discharged into the ceiling, raining plaster down like snow. "Run!" Frank shouted, though he wasn't sure if he meant Rebecca or the backup he hoped was coming. The kitchen erupted into chaos, chairs overturning, Mitchell cursing as hot coffee soaked through his shirt, Rebecca scrambling for something in her bag. Frank heard boots pounding on his front porch, then Maria Santos's voice cutting through the confusion like a blade. "Colorado State Police, drop your weapons!" Mitchell spun toward the sound, his burned hands still gripping the .38, and Frank saw his chance. Rex's old collar was studded with metal buckles, not much of a weapon, but enough. Frank swung it like a sap, catching Mitchell across the wrist. The gun clattered across the linoleum. 53 years, Frank panted, standing over the man who'd orchestrated decades of murder and manipulation. 53 years of thinking I helped kill that boy. Rebecca had frozen by the table, her hands raised as 2 state troopers filled the doorway behind Maria. The family resemblance was unmistakable now. Rebecca had Tommy's eyes, the same defiant tilt to her chin that Frank remembered from Monument Valley. Maria knew, Frank said to no one in particular. Smart girl, always was. Maria Santos stepped into the kitchen, her weapon trained on Mitchell as he clutched his injured wrist. She was 65 now, silver-haired and grandmother soft, but her eyes held the same fire Frank remembered from when she was young. Tommy was left-handed, she said simply. Gun was found in his right. Been waiting my whole career for someone to slip up and prove what really happened. Mitchell Lansing, alive, exposed, diminished, looked nothing like the shadow that had haunted Frank's nightmares. Just an old man in an expensive hat, bleeding Hollywood money and entitlement onto a kitchen floor in Colorado. The others, Frank said, Linda, Robert, Charlie. We'll get them justice too, Maria promised. Been building this case for years, waiting for the right moment. When that white SUV showed up in my jurisdiction, I knew it was time. Frank sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of 5 decades lifting from his shoulders like morning fog burning off the mountains. Through the window, he could see Maggie watching the proceedings with the patient wisdom that horses possessed, as if she'd known all along that this day would come. The truth, Frank realized, was simpler than he'd ever imagined. Sometimes justice moved slowly, but it never stopped moving. Sometimes the people you thought were gone kept working, kept watching, kept waiting for the moment when the past would finally surrender its secrets. Tommy Ridgway could rest now. They all could. The handcuffs clicked shut around Mitchell Lansing's wrists with a sound like dice falling. Frank watched from his chair as the man who'd orchestrated 5 decades of murder was read his rights by a state trooper who looked young enough to be Frank's grandson. Rebecca stood beside her father, her own hands cuffed behind her back, the arrogant confidence finally drained from her face. "The others are already in custody," Maria said, holstering her weapon. "We've been coordinating with FBI field offices across 4 states. Took some doing to convince them that a dead man was killing people, but Charlie Brennan's photographs made believers out of them." Frank felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, but healing, like a bone that had been set wrong for years finally shifting back into place. Steve died thinking he was a murderer. Steve McQueen died protecting what he thought was a friend's reputation, Maria corrected gently. That's not the same thing. Tommy would have understood that. Through the kitchen window, Frank could see more vehicles arriving. Federal agents, crime scene technicians, a coroner's van that would finally take Tommy Ridgway home to proper burial. The quiet ranch that had been Frank's sanctuary for 15 years was about to become the center of a media circus that would dwarf anything Hollywood had ever manufactured. But for the first time since Monument Valley, Frank Morrison wasn't afraid of the truth. "I need to ask you something," he said to Maria, as the troopers led Mitchell and Rebecca toward the door. "All these years you've been bringing me groceries, checking on me. Was that surveillance?" Maria's weathered face softened into something that reminded Frank powerfully of her teenage cousin. "Started that way. Bureau wanted someone keeping an eye on you in case the killers made contact, but after the first year, she shrugged. You were just a lonely old man taking care of herd animals. Figured you'd suffered enough. Mitchell Lansing paused in the doorway, his silver hair disheveled, expensive suit stained with coffee and blood. He looked back at Frank with eyes that held no remorse, only the cold calculation of a man who'd never seen other people as anything more than chess pieces. "You still don't understand what you cost us," he said. "The insurance money was nothing. Those McCarthy letters were worth millions. Political leverage that could have shaped decades of policy. All destroyed because you and McQueen panicked and burned everything in Wayne's trailer." Frank stood slowly, feeling every one of his 75 years, but also feeling stronger than he had since 1969. "Good," he said simply. "Some things deserve to burn." As they dragged Mitchell away, Frank heard him shouting about lawyers and jurisdictional challenges and extradition treaties with countries that didn't exist. The desperate bleating of a predator who'd finally been cornered after half a century of hunting. Rebecca was quieter, her documentary filmmaker persona completely abandoned. As she passed Frank's chair, she stopped for a moment. "Tommy really was a good person," she said quietly, "before my grandfather corrupted him. Before any of this started, I wanted you to know that." Frank nodded, accepting what might have been the only honest thing she'd ever told him. After the house emptied of law enforcement, Frank found himself alone in his kitchen with Maria Santos. The coffee pot was broken, there was a bullet hole in his ceiling, and plaster dust covered everything like snow, but somehow the space felt cleaner than it had in years. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you tell the truth," Maria said. "All of it. Every detail you can remember about Monument Valley, about the cover-up, about what really happened in those 20 minutes between Tommy's death and Wayne's staged collapse. There'll be congressional hearings, probably a special prosecutor. The families of the other victims deserve justice." Frank thought about Linda Chen, about Robert Martinez, about Charlie Brennan, and all the others who died protecting a secret that wasn't what any of them thought it was. They'd been killed to hide the real murder, while the Hollywood legends they thought they were exposing had been victims of manipulation as well. And after the hearings? Maria smiled, and for a moment Frank could see the 15-year-old girl who'd whispered her suspicions at her cousin's funeral. "After that, you get to be Frank Morrison again. Not the man who helped cover up Tommy's murder, because that never happened. Just the man who made a mistake in a moment of panic and spent 50 years paying for it." Outside, Maggie had wandered over to investigate the commotion. She stood at the paddock fence, her intelligent eyes fixed on Frank through the kitchen window, waiting patiently, as she always did, for her human to remember that there were still chores to be done, animals to feed, a life to be lived. Frank Morrison walked to his window and pressed his palm against the glass. For the first time in 5 decades, the reflection looking back at him was someone he could recognize, someone he could maybe learn to forgive. Frank Morrison woke before dawn on the day of his testimony, the way he had every morning for 15 years. But for the first time since Monument Valley, sleep had come easily. No nightmares about Tommy's broken body or Steve McQueen's haunted eyes, just the deep, dreamless rest of a man who no longer carried secrets that weren't his to bear. Maggie nickered softly as he approached the paddock with her morning feed. The old mare had been skittish for weeks during the investigation, sensing the tension that had wrapped around the ranch like barbed wire. Now she pressed her velvet muzzle against his palm, accepting the apple slices he'd brought as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed. The congressional hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock in Denver. Maria would drive him down in her pickup truck. She'd insisted on that, said it was the least she could do after 30 years of pretending to be just the grocery lady. Frank had asked her once why she'd waited so long to act on her suspicions about Tommy's death. Her answer had been simple. Sometimes justice moves slow as winter, but it always comes. Frank cleaned Maggie's stall one last time, his arthritic hands steady on the shovel handle. The morning chores grounded him, reminded him that some things remained constant even when the world shifted beneath your feet. Feed the animals, muck the stalls, check the water troughs. The same routine he'd followed since leaving Hollywood, when guilt had driven him to this remote corner of Colorado to hide among creatures who asked nothing of him but care. The media vans had started arriving 3 days ago, lined up along his gravel drive like mechanical vultures. CNN, NBC, Entertainment Tonight. All of them hungry for the story of how Hollywood's greatest legends had been pawns in a 50-year murder conspiracy. Frank had refused all interviews, but today would be different. Today he would tell the truth to Congress and let the chips fall where they may. Inside the house, he put on the only suit he owned, a charcoal gray number he'd bought for Steve McQueen's funeral in 1980. It still fit, though the shoulders were looser now, as if the weight he'd carried all these years had been physical as well as emotional. He stood before the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie, and saw not the haunted man who'd fled Hollywood, but someone who might once again deserve his own reflection. The manila folder on his kitchen table contained copies of everything: the original police reports, Charlie Brennan's photographs, transcripts of FBI interviews from the 1970s. Maria had walked him through each document, helping him separate what he'd actually witnessed from what guilt had distorted in his memory. The real story was simpler than he'd believed, and more tragic. 3 aging cowboys manipulated by a man who'd seen opportunity in their loyalty to each other. John Wayne had genuinely collapsed that day in Monument Valley. The cancer diagnosis was real, the family's desire for privacy authentic. Steve McQueen's quick thinking had prevented a media feeding frenzy that would have turned Wayne's final years into a spectacle. What they hadn't known was that Tommy Ridgway was already dead by then, killed not by Wayne's panicked blow but by Richard Lansing's calculated bullet. Frank heard Maria's truck crunching up the gravel drive. Through the window he watched her climb out, silver-haired and grandmother soft, but carrying herself with the authority of someone who'd spent decades enforcing the law. She told him yesterday that closing Tommy's case was the proudest moment of her career, even if it had taken 30 years longer than it should have. He walked outside to meet her, pausing at the paddock fence where Maggie watched him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Frank had rescued her from a slaughter auction 7 years ago, nursed her back from neglect and abuse until she trusted human hands again. Perhaps that's what he'd been doing all along out here, not just hiding from his past, but healing from it. "You ready for this?" Maria asked, her voice gentle but firm. Frank looked back at his ranch one more time. The modest house, the weathered barn, the pastures where broken animals had found peace. This place had been his penance for a crime he'd never committed. Now it could be something else, just home. "I'm ready," he said. As they drove toward Denver through the Colorado morning, Frank watched the sun climb over the mountains that had sheltered him for so long. The light was different now, cleaner somehow, no longer filtered through the haze of secrets and lies. Behind them, the ranch grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but never disappeared entirely. It would be waiting when he returned, patient as the horses he'd learned to love. Frank Morrison was going home to tell the truth. After 53 years, it was time. The past had finally stopped hunting him. Now he could face the future,